as I said yesterday, the first half of this class we're talking about history. And I just want to tell you a little bit of a I don't know if it's not really a story, kind of a testimony. When I went to college here, I did not have a class like this. In those days, the education students had what we called Introduction to Education, and then the next semester they had Philosophy of Education. And the pastoral students had School Administration 1 and then School Administration 2. Over the years, I can't remember when, because I've been teaching, it had to be at least 15 years ago, we decided to put those together. So, because there's a lot of things similar in both classes, and we were conserving resources. But what the history, we didn't really talk about much history in school administration. So then when I got my master's degree, when I was getting my master's degree, I had a class called, I think it was called Foundations of Christian Education. And I thought, good, I want to see what are the foundations, because I would figure, I mean, you have to say yes because I'm asking the question this way. This is why you don't ask questions in a paper, because it's just you're forced to say yes. But wouldn't you expect the foundations of Christian education to be found in the Bible somewhere? Okay, yes, yeah. So when we went to our Foundations of Christian Education class, it was a history class. It was a history of education in America. Okay, well that makes sense, because if it's American, it must be Christian, right? And if it's Christian and it's American, and America started in 1620, that would be the foundations. That's the start of Christian education, isn't it? Okay, now you're supposed to obviously say no, because I've asked that question in a sarcastic tone. Okay, so when I ask the question in a convincing tone, it's like, yes. When I ask it in a sarcastic tone, it's like, no. So, I've never done that before in my life, so that's why I was laughing at myself. You're not supposed to do that, though. Anyway, but so I went into that class, or I went through that class and finished in that class, and I'm kind of like, this is stupid. I love American history, and I knew almost all of the stuff that was in the class. The specific key educators, I hadn't necessarily, I'd heard of them, but didn't know much about it. But I took a whole master's degree level class on the history of education in America. And I came out of that with I don't care about, that's not really, really important. Okay? I want to know what the Bible says about it. If we're going to be Christian educators, we want to know what's there, and we should just be able to make up our minds and our decisions and just go with that. Who needs history? Now, I love history, but I came out of that class thinking, who needs history? Now, I'm telling you that story because we're going to spend 2 months talking about history, and you might already be saying, oh, who needs history? I hate history. So, hopefully, there's none of you with that violent reaction toward history, but there's probably some distaste or some like, okay, we'll get through it. So I want to just take a few minutes and think about why it is that we need to study history. And I'm just going to answer that question with one question. Now, if we think about the question, it should help us out. But here's the question, and I want you to think about it. How do you know where you are? How do you know where you are? Now, we're assuming something with that question, aren't we? We're assuming that you know where you are. Okay? So where are you? Fairhaven Baptist Church. Fairhaven Baptist College. Actually in room 541. Fundamentals of Education class. There's a lot of, where are you? But how do you know you're here? You say, that's a tricky question. Well, it's deep philosophy. Okay? But think about it. How do you know where you are? It's not really tricky. if the first thing that comes to mind is, why did he ask that question? I don't want to know the answer. But it's a really simple answer. Let's see if there's any variety here.
Because you've been here before?
Because you've been here before, okay?
You have something to relate it to.
You have something to relate it to. What do you mean by something?
Like, you're here as opposed to somewhere else.
Okay.
So you've got it's relative compared to, like, the world outside.
Okay. What is she assuming? That you've been to other places.
You look at the past.
You look at the past.
Time.
Okay.
You're told where you are?
You're told where you are. Okay, yeah, I mean, it could be that you just, it could be that, you are in a car accident. They make movies about that. You're in a car accident, you're in a coma, and then you wake up and you don't know a thing, and everybody has to tell you who you are, who your husband is, and blah, blah. And actually, you had a husband, but he was murdered he was found murdered in the same place where you were, and now you're accused of it. So that's, there's mystery, suspense. Yeah, you're told where you are. It could be that you're told where you are, but yes?
Because you know where you've been.
Okay, you know where you've been. Okay, so you're here. Well, but where were you yesterday? And go backwards. We know where we are. Okay, and that's just, we have been thinking about that right now in a very basic physical sense. Okay, but you're here in college. Why are you in college? How did you get to be in college? What was the steps? You went to high school, right? Could you be in college without going to high school? Most can't, okay? You could, but some went to grade school and then they had life experience and were able to get a GED or something like that. And then they went to college, right? We know where we are, okay? We're on our way to heaven. How do we know we're on our way to heaven? Because we know where we were. We know what happened in the past, right? So, we really can't know where we are unless we know where we've been. Now, why do we need to know where we are? Why do we need to know where we are? Is that too hard a question? Caitlin, what do you think?
We need to have an understanding of what's going on around us before we can try to tell someone else.
Okay, so we need to know where we are so we can tell someone else where we are. I'm at Kmart. Come pick me up. Well, okay. Barrick?
So we know what we need to be doing?
So we know what we need to be doing. Okay, so I'm here. That means that I need to be doing something. Or, for that matter, we're commanded to grow, right? As Christians, we're to grow in grace and in the knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. We have something to do, don't we? We're left here on earth with something to do. So we need to be doing something. But we won't really know what to do if we know where we are. And we won't know what to do if we don't know how we got to where we are. Probably all of us, can't think of a specific example, but we've probably all been somewhere doing something and then realized it was the wrong thing to do. It would be an okay thing to do in another situation, but not in the situation that we're in. Okay? Yes?
To know where we're going.
To know where we're going. Okay, do you somebody give you my notes from last year? Okay, so actually the sentence I said we can't know where we are unless we know where we've been, I dropped out a phrase and asked the question, why do we need to know where we are? So the sentence really is, and if you're writing, it doesn't really matter. Just rewrite it or put a caret in there and put it up there. We can't know where we are or where we're going unless we know where we've been. So, and that's true, it's absolutely true. Now we have to really know where we've come from. And so we're going to go, when we think about this, We're not going to have super depth, but we're going to go a little farther back than 1620 and the Pilgrims. But still thinking about why we need to understand our history. As we look at history, we need to be able to put ourselves in history. We look at history and say, okay, so where am I? Where do I fit in there? Okay. Actually, we know a little bit of history. We know some history that will happen, don't we? As Christians, we know some history that will happen. So we kind of don't know the time between where we are and where other history is going to take place, but we can put ourselves in a timeline, and we have to put ourselves in a certain spot. Okay, I'm here, and I'm in this particular place. If we were in China or South America, it would be a different perspective. We would have different things to do. Of course, we would have a different story as to how we got to where we were. And that would influence what we're doing there and what we have to do. So we have to be able to place ourselves in history. And for that matter, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. So when I got out of that master's class and said, forget all this other stuff, I just want to know, what the Bible says about education. I was heading toward the direction of saying, I just need to invent the wheel. Because has anybody else, at that point in time, had anyone else looked at the Bible to see what it said about education? Of course, lots of other people. Some of them very prolific authors. Some of them very deep thinkers who for years and years, decades, even centuries, people have looked to what they said because it was very influential about and is very understanding or insightful about what the Bible says about education. But if I throw away history, I can't look at what those other people have said, right? Well, nobody really doesn't look at what history's, what other people say, but sometimes we get this idea that if we're going to be authentic, if we're going to be real, we have to find it in the Bible. Well, we need to see it there, but somebody else can point to it for us. Okay, so and that is all going to the idea of reinventing the wheel. If every generation had to reinvent the wheel, we wouldn't have watches, we wouldn't have devices, we wouldn't have any of that because we all be back at the wheel or the plow, sticking a piece of metal in the ground to break it up, So what we do then is there's a phrase that goes along with reinventing the wheel, and that is that what we do is we stand on the shoulders of the ancients. Okay? They did something, and then we read them and figure out and then we stand on their shoulders. Can we see better than them? If we're on top of their shoulders, we can see better than them. Okay? In what, is that a metaphor, simile? Okay? So they saw stuff. Okay? And since we know what they saw, then we can build off of that and see more. Okay? Somebody invents a wheel. Well, now that I have a wheel, what can I do with a wheel? I can move a cart. I can pull water out of a stream. I can use the water to drive the wheel and grind wheat with it. Okay? And I'm not this is not the history of wheel engineering. But you understand, because we make advancements, when we work from there, then we can make more advancements, whether it's technology or theology. Our theology, if we understand the Bible, we understand how it applies to this situation. Somebody makes that real clear, and then we read that and understand it. We say, okay, well, if that's true, then it's also true over here. Or new situation arises. We have technology in education. What do we do about technology in education? Nobody's ever written about technology in education. Let's go back a few years when they had it. What do we do? Well, we're just going to have to dive into the Bible and completely figure out what the Bible has to say about technology. Do we need to do that? No. Other people have written about education We can work as long as they have been faithful to the Bible, and we can judge that because we have the Bible. We can work from their thinking and apply it to new situations. So we stand on their shoulders. But to be able to stand on their shoulders, we have to know who they are and where their shoulders are. We have to have read some of what they said, understand what they brought. And that is, of course, history. So we must also, but while we're doing that, we must learn from history. If we look back in history, some people think that they look back in history and say, well, this is the way it should be done because this is the way it was done. Or some people look back in history and say, don't do it that way because, you know, they were pagans and we're Christians, so we can't do anything that is pagan. Well, pagans taught their children, you know, so should we not teach our children? Anyway, okay, so that was the sarcastic, so it's like, no. Okay, anyway, but the point is we have to learn from history. As Christians, with a Christian understanding of man and mankind, we can look back in history and say, okay, this is what they did. What part of what they did was right? What part of what they did doesn't seem to be right? And since it's history, we can see the results of what they did, right? We can't see the results of what we're doing, right? But we can go back in history and say, okay, so at this point in time, we see there was, you know, people did this. Whether we're talking about anything, but we're talking about education here. They taught this way, or they taught these principles. Generally, this culture had this type of feeling about education. What are the results of that? That culture, something changed in that culture. Did the education change? Did the understanding of education change? Was that a contribution to it? Was it just an invasion from another people or something? I mean, there's many different reasons why things change in a culture or in a country. But as educators, we want to look at that and see, okay, how did they think? What happened? Okay. This part of what they thought doesn't seem to be right. Am I right? Am I right in condemning this part of their thought? How would I know if I'm right? Well, if I see that thought, I say, well, it seems to me if people think this way, this is going to happen. What can we do? We just look a little closer in history and see if that happened. Okay, so we're not just looking to history just to look at it. We have to be able to evaluate it. We have to look back there and say, this was good, this was bad, and we can see the results, and because it's history, we can verify whether what we thought was good, or what we thought was bad, or if there was this was good except this part of it. We can see, we can measure that, we can check our own judgment or evaluation because it's all in history. So as we look at history, and this is general, we'll try to do this some along the way, but I want us to be thinking this way, and whether we're in this class or any other history class, as we look at history, we're going to evaluate, judge these things. If we see a period of time when the culture is godly, I'm not saying Christian necessarily, I'm not saying like everybody in the culture goes to church and are fundamental Baptists. That has never happened. But if we see things in a culture that we like, we should go back to that time and then right before that time to see what caused that. What caused this favorable time period in history? Especially if we see a favorable time period in history, or what we would say a good time period in history, and then we see a bad time period in the same culture, what are we going to want to see? What happened? What happened between that? When did it happen? Most likely it happened while things were good. When things are good in the culture, the seeds of something bad is taking place in the ground, and then it bears fruit. Most likely, if something's good, how did it start to be good? It happened because something before it, in a time that wasn't so good, people started changing. And then those seeds grew into good ideas and good things happening. So we want to look for cause and effect. If there's something good, what caused that? Can we see it? If there's something bad, what caused that? Can we notice that? We also should look to see how Christians lived in their culture. So, because when we look at history, we're going to see good cultures, bad cultures. We're going to see good things, bad things. But we know there's always Christians there. Okay? So how did Christians respond? What did they do? What did Christians do in communist Russia? Let's bring it not out of ancient history into fairly modern history. What did they do? Did they do the same thing we do in America? No. Dumb Christians, they should have just been doing what we did in America. Well, they couldn't. They're in a different culture. But what did godly people do in that culture? Now, let's go way back. Okay? What did Christians do in Roman culture? Did they use that Bob Jones University Press textbook? Or the Abeka, the owl? Did they have kindergarten schools with kindergarten graduations? No, they didn't. Okay? But what did they do? We should understand that. They're good Christians. We can see that. We see from their other writings and their beliefs and what they did. How did they respond to the situation they were in? We can learn from that. We can learn from that, and then we can build off of that. So, how did Christians, and we're, again, just thinking education here, but how did Christians in these different cultures in history, how did they act out their Christianity? Anybody can, we can all have the right theology, but the theology has to come out of our fingers, in our toes. We have to walk that. So how did Christians who believe the same as us apply that in a different situation, in another culture, in another time period of history? And then this might not be as noticeable. This is more of a philosophical question. But in history, how did people communicate? You know, we're saying, here we are, we know where we are, this is what we should do. What did people say 100 years ago? Here we are, we know where we are, this is what we should do. What was their vision? How did that change over time? How was it affected by the time period they were in or the culture they were in? That's another thing to think about and consider when we look into history. So, I have a goal during this time period in our class, when we're talking about history, I want us to remember and think, and I don't know if I'll say it every day, but I want us to be thinking of this theme, and the theme is that all education is religious. Okay? All education is religious. When we're going to, hopefully, it's going to be undeniable as we go all the way through history that all education is religious. And one of the reasons we want to make that the case for that is because now, in fairly modern, recent times, people want to say, well, there needs to be a separation between religion and education. Of course, this is kind of an American invention, and we're going to explain how this happened. But since education is the domain of the government, and the government can't be religious, then education can't be religious. But our point is to show in history that education is inherently religious. It cannot be not religious. Okay? So, as we look at each culture, we're going to want to see that no one, until recent times, has ever tried to separate religion from education. And the reason for that is because it can't be. Even now, a secular education is a religious education. And actually, we're coming to a point in history where we can verify that by history itself. Okay? 25 years ago, 40 years ago, Christian educators were looking at what is happening right now and saying, 150 years ago in America, almost 200 years ago now, Christians were saying, you can't give education to the state because it's religious. It needs to remain in the hands of the churches and religious education. Because if you do that, this is going to happen. And lo and behold, it has happened. So, all right, so that's our theme. If we have a theme for the class, is that all education is religious, or a theme for the, not for the class, for this first part of the class. So let's think a little bit about ancient education. When we say ancient education, those that don't believe the Bible would call it prehistoric education. Or even, and I will with hesitancy use this term pre-literate times. Now if we strictly define pre-literate as people who have and use a written language, then there would be a small period of time when mankind was pre-literate. We don't know when, okay? But Adam had to have at least a couple days to figure out how to write things down. And, when it's just Adam and Eve and his 45 children, we don't know how many children he had, but we know he had some daughters because his son's married and so on. And he lived for, 900 and some years and had sons and daughters. So, but even that's a small class, and, he could teach and pass on what he knew and all that without writing things down. Okay? But sometime, since we believe in creation, and since we believe that Adam was probably the most intelligent person that ever lived on the face of the earth, think about that. He was, because he sinned, and the rest of us have, it just goes downhill from there, pretty much. In intelligence. Knowledge is a different thing than intelligence. Okay? We all know a lot more than Adam did. I mean, Adam didn't know anything about technology like we have. He didn't know how to log into a computer. Okay? But he had intelligence. He was intelligent enough to name all the animals. He didn't name them in Latin, though. See, we call them by their Latin names. We're more, more intelligent than he is. Okay, that was the sarcastic tone. So, but the point is, somewhere in there, and I don't know where, and I don't much care, but there was a time, I will admit, there was a time when people were what we would call pre-literate. And even, you say, there was? Well, there's still people that are pre-literate. There's cultures that have regressed, I would say, probably, but they've been so far away from other literate cultures that they don't even have a written language. There's groups of Christians, not the type that we would do a lot of fellowshipping with, but they look for cultures that don't have a written language, and they immerse themselves in that culture, try to figure out the words, and then they create an alphabet for them. And then they teach them, they teach them to be literate, and then they write a Bible for them. They translate a Bible for them. So those cultures exist still today. Obviously, they happened sometime in our common history. But civilized history, civilized folks had a short period of time where they were not literate. But they still had to teach. How did they teach? If they didn't write it down. Just because they're pre-literate or illiterate, does that mean that they didn't have a language? No. Man was created with language. So they had language, they just didn't write their language down. What did they do with their language? They spoke it, right? Because they couldn't write it down. And what can we do with spoken language? How do we teach somebody something with spoken language? What tools do we use in spoken language? We have traditions. Every year we do the same thing. Why do we do this, Daddy? Well, because. Okay? All of us grew up with language and written language. But just think, even in your written language upbringing, some of the things you did, nobody wrote to you and said, now we do this at this time because you just did it. You had a tradition, a family tradition, or even a cultural tradition. There's also the culture just says you should do things or shouldn't do things. That's called cultural prescriptions. But in the village where you live, you learn pretty quickly what you should do and what you shouldn't do. Because everybody down the block, they don't want you walking through their grass. Lady comes out and says, stay on the sidewalk. Okay? Oral instruction, right? She doesn't put a sign up. I mean, now, maybe she does. Writes it out. But you can imagine, you don't have to have written language to tell people how to act, what to do. And learning how to act, what to do, is education. There's also oral traditions. When I say oral tradition, what comes to mind? Caitlin.
Folklore?
I'm sorry?
Folklore?
Folklore. When we say folklore, what comes to mind? Meadow?
Wisdom that's passed down from...
Wisdom that's passed down. Okay, when you think of wisdom that's passed down from parents to the next generation, what do you think of? How is that done? Oral tradition. I hear... Go ahead. Stories. Okay. Stories, songs. Proverbs. Dad always says, whatever. Certain phrase, you learn something. Okay? So, and those are oral traditions. So people without language can be educated. I'm sorry. People without written language can be educated. People, because their people have language. We said that already, right? But people without a written language can be educated, and they can know a really lot. Okay? I would like, I'm tossing this idea around to have you guys do just a little quick reading on what a typical Hebrew child would learn. Typical. Now, of course, they didn't have games to distract them. But they learned a tremendous amount of things. And they learned it pretty much orally. You say, well, they had the Bible. Yeah, they did. Where? It wasn't at their house. The synagogue. There wasn't a synagogue until 550 or later BC. So, where was David's Bible? Now, it had to get in his head. There wasn't just, don't get me wrong, there wasn't just one at the tabernacle. But think of handwriting with the level of accuracy that you would insist on because it was God's words. And think about how many copies you could make of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, just the 5 books of the law. How quickly it would take to do that. How many of those would be in the land of Israel? Okay? I don't want us to think that there wouldn't be that there would be, rare and few and way, way between, but there wouldn't be as many as what we have. Okay? Probably a family would have to go somewhere to actually see one and read it. Okay? In the land of Israel, there were 48 Levitical cities, right? The Levites were the teaching class of the people of Israel. The Levites they would have access to the Word of God. They probably, Levitical families, probably some of them just copied the Word of God so that they would have copies. Okay? I don't want us to think that it wasn't accessible. The Bible was accessible. But just because it's accessible doesn't mean it's really easy to get a hold of. It is possible to get a hold of. They'd have to put forth some effort. If a family wasn't so keen on being godly, do you think those kids saw the Bible very often? No. So, but the point is, where I was going with this, children in Israel, they could learn a real lot. You get into New Testament times when the Bible is more accessible. You have synagogues in a town where there's 10 families or more, and in those synagogues they're collecting writings, even extra biblical writings and the scriptures, and they're going there every week, and children are going there 2 or 3 times during the week to learn. Then they're learning even more. But just so an oral education can be can be quite large. And then quickly, somehow, somebody discovered the magical substance that could speak when a person is not there. A person could speak with his magical substance when no one is there, and someone later on could hear what he says. Ink. Right? You're writing it down, and later on, somebody else, you're writing down things that I've said. Sometime later on, you can look at that, and you can know what I said, even though I'm not there. So we have, and that begins to develop into a written language. We have symbols that represent sounds, and then those sounds are put together to represent, words and ideas, and we have language. And that's the beginning of tremendous amounts of information being given to us. Because that information can be saved. It's not just into the air and saved by a mind. It can be saved and passed to the next generation. And then, of course, the printing press comes along thousands and thousands of years later, and then you have movable type press and all that. Yes, Barrick.
I think there was somewhat of a written language before ink because of the they carve things.
Right, okay. So, yes. You could... but I would think, my thinking is, once they figured to write, they're quickly going to figure out stuff to write with, beside carving. Because the stone tablet it's a lot easier to just touch the screen. So, but yes, they would use wax tablets. And they had, I can't remember the name of it, but they'd have a writing instrument. Well, what the cuneiform is, when you read cuneiform, you have to look even at the angle that the indentation was made in the clay, because different angles would be different. It's like a shape, okay, but they couldn't. It's hard to draw a circle in clay, but you have a wedge, and you put it at different angles, and turns into letters and sounds. So yes, it wasn't necessarily, but I would say it wouldn't take long for people to come up with things beside clay to write with. I guess the ink idea would be more lasting. I can write with water on paper. I can you can see something and then it evaporates and it's gone. Or you can make indentations in the sand, and it disappears. And that's what happens with cuneiform and tablet. If it doesn't harden, And so little boys, even in Greek culture, they would have a wax tablet. It'd be hard, write on it, show it to the teacher, okay, put it near a flame, melt it, smooth it out, do it again. So yeah, so the ink and language idea, that kind of, I think, in my opinion, would have come close to one another and maybe back and forth. So, when we look back at history, some of the more ancient history, we have to translate there's a ton of historians, they look back at archaeology and all that, and most of them are not Bible believers, okay? But we can't throw away everything they see and report to us. If they say we can see this happening and this happening and this happening, and they say, so obviously that was about 55,000 years ago or 1 million years ago, we can throw out the dates, but we can't throw out what they saw. Do you understand how we can take some things from somebody and leave other things from somebody? We still do that. I mean, if somebody says, we saw a dinosaur, we might say, well, how much of that dinosaur? And if it's just, 1/4 of a kneecap, we might say, well, maybe that's not a dinosaur. But there's a lot of dinosaurs around. I mean, not living ones, sorry. But there's a lot of dinosaur bones around. Okay? So what they see, as long as they're reporting it honestly, we can understand, we can say, well, yeah, their interpretation of it is going to be different than ours. But I guess the point I'm saying is, if we have a tradition, if tradition says this, there's probably a high level of accuracy in that. As Baptists, we don't like tradition. Okay, because we've been trained to think that the Catholic Church has the Bible and tradition. Well, that's not the only tradition out there. Okay, there's traditions from, ages and ages before there ever was a Catholic Church. And those traditions are interpreted. We can interpret it one way, other people can interpret it another way. Archaeology is, it's like, it doesn't speak to you. Okay, you just see something and you have to interpret it. All that to go into saying however other people interpret it, we can look back at history and even look at traditions and say, well, they were doing this at this time. It was a tradition at this time. So it had to have been happening before that. How long does it take for something to become a tradition? Is it 23 times? That's for a habit. But how long does it take for something to become a tradition? In a family, maybe not that many times, but in a culture, they're always doing it this way. That speaks toward history. So it speaks to the early existence of at least the idea that's there. Of course, traditions get adjusted over time, but they have a root, that is something. So we should remember that as we look and read stuff about history. Sumer, if you've had just a general history of civilization, Sumer is considered the very first civilization, right? Sumer, Shinar, whatever you would have called it, 3,500 to 3,000 BC. And what people have found in Sumer, in that level of archaeology and geography, is that that they instructed their boys in reading and writing. They instructed the talented boys, and the education happened sometime between 5 and 17, somewhere in that range. In our minds, I would say probably biblically, the first civilizations we see come from that same area of the world, Sumer, and in Chaldea and Babylon. Okay? And in Chaldea and Babylon, we have found, I haven't been there, but there have been found well-equipped schools. They can tell by the structure of the foundations and stuff and what they find within the locations, schools, and they have found tablets, clay tablets, and they've been able to translate what's on the clay tablet. And on the clay tablet are methods of religious instruction. Okay, so as an educator, and we're all educators in here, there's a very significant word in that statement. I'll say it again, see if you can pick it out. In Chaldean Babylonia, they found tablets with methods of religious instruction on them. What sticks out to you is really significant there? Religious? Okay? That's good, because I said the theme is that we're always going to have religious. But more I think, more significant than religious? Bethany.
Instruction.
Instruction. That's good too. But even more significant than that. We're narrowing down the words there so more people are willing to. Serenity?
Methods. They would develop it.
Methods. Okay? It's not just some religious information or religious instruction. A method is what? What is a method? It's how. If I develop a method, I have this method that I use. Okay? It has to be something that other people want, pretty much, if I'm going to write down my method of instruction. Okay? So, with a method, that means people were wanting to know not just what to teach, but how to teach. And that's way back. That's long ways back. Think about Egypt. Think about Egypt. Egypt was strong and what we would say, I don't know, prosperous or significant as a culture for nearly 3,000 years. About 3000 BC to 300 BC. What do you think they learned in Egypt? What do you think they taught in Egypt? Say, I don't know anything about Egypt. Yes, you do. You know lots about Egypt. Just from reading the Bible, you know lots about Egypt. Barrick?
They had many gods.
They had many gods, okay. So if they had many gods, what did their culture have? What's that?
An education.
What kind of education related to the many gods? Religious, okay. How do you think they worship those gods? Or where do they worship those gods? What do people always do if they have a god? What's that?
They build a temple.
They build them something. How do they build them something? How do they know how to build them something? What did they know in order to build them something? Engineering? They knew something about different types of materials, right? What else do we know about Egypt? What's very significant to the land of Egypt? Dave?
Pyramids?
I'm sorry?
Pyramids?
Sure, but from the Bible doesn't talk about pyramids. Very significant to the life of Egypt. Joy? The Nile River. Okay. What about the Nile? It's just a river. The Nile worked a certain way, didn't it? Which caused them to learn and know certain things. What do they have to know about?
Agriculture.
Agriculture. What else?
Trade.
I'm sorry, trade. Okay, if they had trade, that would mean they were learning from even other cultures beside agriculture. Did you catch that? That was a joke. Irrigation. They had ways. Deuteronomy says that in Egypt they got their water using their feet. But in the land of Israel, God would send rain from heaven. Okay? They used their feet to pump the water out into the fields. Okay? So, the Bible tells us that they had irrigation methods. Irrigation is engineering of another sort. Okay, they did, without the Bible, we know they had the pyramids and temples, so architecture. It was a large country. There was a lot of things going on there. It's 10 o'clock, so some people need to leave. It's 10 till, so some people need to leave. Ensemble is blessing us with a song today. But what was Joseph? What was Joseph? Second in command. So there must have been a command somewhere, right? And if he's in command, what was he in command of? Do you think everybody brought their grain to Joseph himself? Every person in the land brought their surplus to Joseph himself? No. He had IRS agents. It was a tax. It's clearly a tax, right? 20% of this or whatever. They had a whole system of collecting money or collecting goods for the state, and another whole system for distributing those goods. Maybe it was the same system, but sometimes it was coming in, sometimes it was going out, and that was just, just the food, just the crops. They knew about what we would call statecraft, managing a state, government. We, from history, can see that they were interested in medicine and anatomy. We see that from their embalming stuff. We know they had a writing system. It was hieroglyphics. Took us a long time, to figure out what they were writing there. But the Rosetta Stone helped us figure that out. It did, actually. It wasn't not on the computer. And when we look at that, we see that they had religious systems written out, political systems, medical developments. And then let me just point out, and they had a school system. We can just look at it and see that they knew all this stuff, but they had a school system, and it was, guess where the school system was? It was connected to the temples. Okay? And it trained scribes to read and write. It was built as part of their temple complexes, and it gave, at certain levels, it proceeded and it increased in difficulty in learning. So more would come for simpler education, and then some would continue on, and then the advanced education was for the priests, the government officials, and the physicians. Very simple. Priests, religion, government officials, law, and physicians, medicine. We're going to see those three at the top of education throughout all of history. We should, but I would point out, there's at least two men in Bible history we know that were either had or had more than the education of the Egyptians. Who do you think? Caitlin is just like, she's the answer lady today.
Moses was trained by God in the wilderness.
Well, but who was he trained by before that?
His mother,
Where was she?
the Hebrews.
No. He was trained by the Egyptians for probably 35 years if we keep him at home for a long time. He went into the palace, and he didn't go to the playground. He went into the palace and he was trained. He was, tradition puts him as a tremendous Egyptian general. So we didn't even talk about that. War. Methods of war. Organization of troops. Okay? And the Bible says he was an eloquent speaker. He claims not to be one when he's speaking with God, but in the New Testament it tells us he was an eloquent speaker. And he had all the training of Egypt. Okay? And it was a good thing because he had to manage 2 million people. And those 2 million people needed food. He got some help on that one. Okay? But right? Okay. And then the Bible tells us that Solomon excelled. Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the children of the east country and all the wisdom of Egypt. And then I want to also point out that Abraham, and I know Abraham is the father of the Hebrews, but he was the father. You know, there wasn't much of a Hebrew nation there. There wasn't many Hebrew traditions with Abraham. He was making them. He didn't even know it. But he trained and taught his family. God said about Abraham, I've just had this thought recently. Sometime, and I haven't done it myself, but I think it'd be interesting to see when the Bible tells us what God thought of people. I can only think of two, and so there might only be two. But if there's only two, it's interesting that they're both positive. God said, have you considered, have you considered my servant Job? He's an upright man. You think Job was a sinner? Yeah, but God thought of him. He had considered him. And then he says, I know him that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment. Okay, so God knew that Abraham would teach his household. And another point, the Bible tells us that Abraham had 319 trained servants. What were they trained in? In that instance, we know they were trained in battle. So if you had 319 trained servants, we would assume that those are men. So how big was Abraham's tent? Or how many tents were with Abraham's tent? If you had 319 servants and you're not really an army, you're just trained to be able to fight, what are all those servants doing? Probably a lot of different things. And do you think they had wives? You think man and woman gets together, there might be some children? I mean, Abraham was a little city. You know, probably over 1,000 people there. You know, so when it says that the flocks of Abraham and the flocks of Lot, you know, had a little hard time staying separate, it's not just like me and my 5 acres of sheep. 1,000 people, lots of them, and they were trained. How were they trained? Well, probably some of those servants were teachers. Or maybe at that point they were just passing on information orally. All right, it is time to be done. I'm having so much fun, we're going to have to start going faster.